Welcome everyone to our second annual Gender Equality Week event. Yay! So we had about 100 people registered, and I think they're having trouble. We're getting tweeted at that they're having trouble getting past security and getting out of the UN. So hopefully people will trickle in. However, we do have an audience that is not in the room, but makes the room a lot larger. So we have usually between 1,500 and 2,000 people that join us via Facebook Live to hear what we're saying, and then we have a lot of sort of post-event moments as well, so that reach really amplifies and is exponential in a really good way. I was saying to some of the speakers that we have a good crowd that follows, listens to our full events, and then feeds in. Because for us, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, we are a membership-based organization. We have over 100 members that are from the private sector, the not-for-profit and charitable sector, as well as academic institutions. They're Canadian-based organizations who work in global health, and a lot of them are small and medium-sized NGOs, and they can't afford to make the UNGA trip. As many of you know who did make the trip, New York's an expensive place to come and to travel and to get around. So the Facebook Live is really a way that we connect in. I wanted to open the event by acknowledging the territory we're on. And I don't know for our American colleagues if you hear this very often, but as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations that came out of Canada, they talked about understanding the traditional territories that you're on and speaking and a part of. So I did a little bit of research with my team, and this is the land of the Lenape people, which actually spreads crossed over their land, so the American-Canadian border in this case, though their plights were particularly challenging because they were often left almost stateless, right? Because half your brother and your sister could be over in what's now known as Canada, and the rest of your family in what's now known as the United States of America, and so your experience could be terribly different, and then of course disconnected. And so I acknowledge respectfully the land of the Lenape people and just really want to honor the generations of care that they've brought in my remarks. So what are we here to do today? It is Gender Equality Week in Canada. So you may not know about that because it's only the second year it's happened. It was created by an act of parliament last year, and then the first Gender Equality Week took place at this time. It will always painfully fall over UNGA because they happen at the same time. So I will probably always be in the United States of America for Gender Equality Week as long as I'm doing this work. So CanWaCH wanted to bring you together and have a conversation about gender equality. When we started discussing this, we realized something somewhat frightening. It's Gender Equality Week. Gender equality is one of those kind of political topics. And it's an election period for us in Canada, and in the election period, government goes into caretaking mode. Civil society tends to get, the nonpartisan civil society that I represent, tends to get pretty nervous and quiet about the remarks that they give in public. So we went, oh boy, how are we going to have an event at UNGA, highly political place and space to be in, about a contested and political topic during an election week or period when we can get in trouble for most everything we say. So let me just say to the Elections Canada's people who are watching on Facebook Live, there's no one in the room, but if there are, this event is not intended to tell you who to vote for. It is not intended to represent or push for any one political party agenda. In fact, what we are saying by this event and by this panel is that no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, it is incredibly challenging. It is a personal journey to fight for gender equality. The second thing that we want to say is that gender equality must be owned by all parties, by all citizens, by all people. So this isn't about the folks who created the week. This isn't about the folks that we will have in office post October 21st. This is about gender equality, which is an issue that stretches far past any political mandate, as those politicians tend to come and go. which all of our politicians in Canada right now are very acutely aware of. So that's all I'll say about that. The way that we wanted to organize the event was to think about where we've come from, celebrate where we've come from, the 2 steps forward. We wanted to reflect on where we still need to go. We wanted to interrogate why we've taken steps forward and steps back. And then we wanted to agitate a little. And so for that agitation, which Ali said, when you mean agitation, do you mean that sound on the subway that's like so squeaky and loud that we've learned all too well this week? Or what do you mean? And I said, really, we want to get people fired up about this and really kind of dismantle, again, some of that partisan thinking, some of that old thinking, and see if we can't advance together. So we brought together this fantastic group of women to the stage. They're united by a few things. They're united by the fact that they've all personally sort of undertaken acts, and when I say acts, I don't mean act, I don't mean one act, I mean personal acts that have had a collectively large impact on their communities, countries, and in the world. And that is incredibly profound, to think that it is the personal act that often doesn't get seen. It's leaving a job to go to the next one that's a small secretariat of very low pay, nothing, to fight for a movement. It's writing something down that takes incredible bravery and putting it out in the world. It is putting your name on a ballot as a student, just randomly throwing yourself out there to see what happens and getting elected. These are personal acts that can have a profound impact, and they have an impact across the political spectrum and across the globe. So when we selected the speakers, that's what we were looking for, and most certainly, that's what we found. Before I do go through their bios, I am without a mic. I can project. Oh, here, let's try this. Hello? Hello? Oh, good. As long as we don't get feedback. Great. So before I go through a few words about each of the speakers, I want to thank Tech, who's our sponsor for this evening. Like I said, CanWaCH is really thinking about how to engage the private sector effectively in our partnership to be more than a CSO, an academic institution, and Tech has been on the forefront of really coming along that journey with us, and we're so excited. They joined as a member this last year. We're so excited to see where it goes. They're, of course, have a Zinc and Health partnership with Government of Canada, as well as with Nutrition International and UNICEF, and do a lot of really excellent work on gender equality. So a big thank you to Tech for your support. And then as well, just acknowledging Global Affairs Canada. They have supported us in partnership as an organization to grow and become what we are, and it is in that partnership that we are able to undertake these events and undertake the thinking behind these events, which is the big work. So a few words about our speakers. I am going to introduce them each, and then I am going to turn over the mic, and they're just going to pass the mic. So you're not going to hear from me again until the end. I didn't ask Kathryn if I could tell this story, so I hope that it's okay. It's not a bad story. But the first time that I met you, or saw you rather, was at the G7, when you were representing the States alongside our minister, and I was part of the W7. So there was 400 people, 400 wild sort of feminists from all over the globe sitting out in the audience, and there was a lot of that kind of feminist norming thing that happens around cheering. So when do you cheer, when do you not cheer, when certain political people are speaking? And I remember that Ms. Kaufman, I was sort of not paying, I was tired, jet-lagged, and not paying a ton of attention, and she spoke about how there's a record number of American women who are right now in politics. And the crowd didn't cheer. And I was woken up by the fact that she said, hey, that's something to cheer about. I am from where I'm from, but feminists, let's get behind each other. And then people cheered because it was like, she is right. That is a good point, right? And I think that's part of why I wanted to have her here, was that notion that we automatically make assumptions and norm people as feminists, as advocates, as progressives, and we stop listening, right? And so she really woke up that crowd to listen, and I did listen, and I'm just so appreciative that you're here. So Ms. Kaufman has built a career serving public and private sectors with a focus on how pursuing governments and private industry can work together on innovation and coming up with solutions. She's the managing director of the Global Women's Issues for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. You might know it as OPIC. A self-sustaining U.S. government agency that helps American businesses invest in emerging markets. It's a very exciting, if you've not heard of OPIC, I encourage you to go have a look. And certainly, we in Canada are looking towards how we can use that type of innovation, interesting financing models, to drive development. And before joining OPIC, Ms. Kaufman was a founding partner with New Magellan Ventures, a venture capital and project development firm in Washington, defense policymaker, all kinds of things, advising and advancing an agenda that includes gender equality as well as security within the United States. Laurin Liu, who's next to you, was a Canadian Member of Parliament between 2011 and 2015. She was the youngest ever woman elected to the Canadian House of Commons. So at age 20, she did what very few Canadians in their lifetime, or people in their lifetime across this globe will do, put her name out there in an act of bravery, and then she got elected, which was very exciting. So she put her name forward in Quebec, where she was studying at McGill at the time. So she served as an MP for 4 years. She gave some advice to colleagues of ours on how to advance an agenda effectively with MPs. And I have to say, it was some of the most candid advice that we've ever received. And maybe it's because you've left politics, or I don't know, but it was just so honest and candid about how we as civil society advocates can advance an agenda, and I thank you for that. So Robin, who's at the end, was a co-founder and lead of the London-based support team for She Decides. For many of you know She Decides. It started out as this tiny grassroots thing, became a global movement, and Robin was at the head of that. Before that, she worked with DFID, spent a lot of time working on the AIDS movement, and wrote the first ever book on women and AIDS called Vamps, Virgins, and Victims, How Can Women Fight AIDS? And I think that's a nice little teaser to what she's going to talk about. Another little teaser about what she's going to talk about and who Robin is. The first time that I really met her, we were sitting at a bar in Kigali, and I knew who she was, but she was sort of across the bar, and there was a man holding court with a bunch of women and trying to engage in conversations, and all of us were trying to get some work done, and this is a comment specifically about this one man who was very frustrating to deal with and tried to explain to us many things about the conferences that we had just presented at. And so it was kind of one of those moments, and he orders a glass of wine, and Robin goes, "Oh, that's total crap wine, but I just got another one." Proceeds to dump her glass of wine into his glass that she's already drank, and she's like, "It's terrible wine anyway, see you later," and walks away. So that's how I first met Robin, and then we proceeded to go and do an event in Delhi together, and the stories more or less stayed the same. So you have this dynamic group of women, and with no further ado, I'm going to pass it over and have them talk about those personal pushes that they've made, those individual choices, the kinds of impacts that we're looking for, and how a gender equality agenda fits within any political party. A gender equality agenda fits within any political moment. With that, to Kathryn.
Thank you so much. The young, idealistic Kathryn Kaufman that was getting her graduate degree in international relations and global development had no idea that the most challenging part of adulthood would be becoming a mom. After years of IVF and miscarriages, after experiencing the joy of being pregnant, I finally recently admitted that I would never be a birth mother. And after accepting that and feeling incredibly crushed by it, I have accepted it as this incredible gift. Because it was a hardship that I was able to share with some of my female friends and experience some of their hardships, and learn about what women go through, from infertility to having to have an abortion because of the health of your fetus. And I just learned so much, especially how damn powerful women are and strong. But that hardship and that experience impacted me so that when in May, legislation in Alabama passed restricting women's right to sexual reproductive health, I felt differently about it. I felt that I really needed to speak out for the experience that I had had and the experiences that others had shared with me. And as a U.S. government official, my speaking out on that meant I would have to kind of go against my boss, who's the President of the United States. So it was not a really simple decision. And as I was making the decision, funny enough, I thought back a lot to that graduate student who had paid a lot of money to go to classes to learn to be a principled leader. And what does that mean? And so I ended up making the decision to write an op-ed voicing my opinion that Republican women that support full reproductive and sexual health rights should be more vocal about it and stand up for that opinion. And since I made that decision, I have had more conversations about sexual and reproductive health in a few months than I thought I would have in a lifetime. And I thought I would just share 2 observations that those conversations have left me with over the past couple months. And the first is that there is a lot of self-censorship around this issue. It was a really tough issue for me to talk about in my family. I grew up in a Republican family, and honestly, we just don't talk about it. And when I would ask my mom, oh, how does your best friend, who's someone that I grew up knowing everything about, feel about this? It's like, oh, we wouldn't ask about that. And I thought about, I'm sure you're all familiar with the bathroom bill that passed in North Carolina. Companies fled North Carolina. The NCAA canceled a basketball tournament because we were telling people which public bathroom to use. Legislation in Alabama passes restricting a woman's right to make decisions about her own body in the case of rape. I'm not aware of one company that left the state of Alabama, or even like a football response. And so I really am worried about this issue of self-censorship, and that we're not speaking out enough about this issue. And that leads to my second observation, which is we're really not precise with our words to give every woman who has an opinion on this issue the dignity that opinion deserves. And I learned that from my own words as I was trying to talk to some of my really strong pro-life, pro-feminist friends. And I found I was making blanket statements where it was my belief that the only right position was the pro-choice position, just by the way I was using my words. And I don't believe that. Frankly, I have all the time in the world for any woman that has a position on this topic. Little less time for men that have a position on it, to be honest, because they don't understand what it means to carry a child or what it means to go through a lot of these issues that we go through. So I guess I really believe in the power of women to make space for each other and to speak more precisely, to give each other's opinion more dignity. And I think that if we do that, we'll get a lot less self-censorship and a lot more positive policy decisions that support women, particularly women in crisis. So thanks so much.
That was really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. My name is Laurin, and in 2011, much to my surprise, I was elected to the Canadian House of Commons, making me the youngest female MP to ever serve on Parliament Hill. And as a teenager, I was really interested in politics. I was passionate about door knocking, starting campus clubs, and going to political conventions. And I really loved all of it, the whole process and the whole action of politics. But when I got to Parliament Hill, I was shocked to realize that it was and remains today very much a boys' club. So I would go to meetings and people would address my male assistants instead of speaking directly to me. Another MP told me that she started leaving her partner at home because people would start talking to him like he was the elected representative instead of talking to her. Sexual harassment was very, very common. I constantly received comments about my body, my appearance. Another MP spoke about how a constituent told her that she had a nice rack. And I was constantly involuntarily grabbed, and at one point really felt that my body, as a public figure and as a woman in the public sphere, that my body no longer really belonged to me, and that was a pretty disempowering feeling that took me a while to sort of process and understand. But it was really during my time in office between 2011 and 2015 where we started to have a really powerful conversation about feminism and about what it means that, about the fact that there isn't a perfect victim. We started having this conversation in Canada, and I don't know if you remember this hashtag, but the hashtag been raped never reported. So we started talking about why women might not want to report sexual assault, might not want to report rape. And we actually started having a pretty fulsome conversation about how day in and day out our justice systems and our communities fail women who are sexually assaulted. So that was a very powerful conversation, and is a conversation that was buttressed by the feminists that came before us, the women who sort of paved the way. But it was very much led by young women who were putting voice, and young women who were finding new words to express our relationship to men, our experiences, our stories of sexual assault, and ultimately our very humanity and our very worth as human beings. So I think that was very powerful, and in the, since the time that I was a teenager, I've really seen that language change and that movement happen within, mainstream society. But I'm here to talk as well about how I'm a bad feminist. And Roxane Gay famously said this. She wrote a whole book about it in 2014, talking about how she was a bad feminist. And that's because we're all flawed and none of us are perfect. And feminism shouldn't be about calling people out. It shouldn't be about punishing people or ourselves for not being perfect. Because feminism is a constant journey of learning. And, we're all, I'm a bad feminist because we're all born into this world, and we're often taught from the time we were children these biases, these prejudices, and these beliefs that don't lead us to gender equality. And so realizing that it was okay to be flawed and to be a bad feminist was really liberating. But also learning how to be better was something that I learned as well when I was in politics. And so learning, one of the most important things that I realized about learning was that it's really important to identify our own blind spots. So I want to challenge everyone in this room to do something, and this is something that I do as well. But when you go to work, and when you're with your friends, when you go out, take a look around and notice how many people around you don't look like you and don't have the same life experience. Because if we're only surrounding ourselves by like people, we're only hearing one perspective, and we will never, and we need to learn empathy. So pick up a book written by a person of color, and also make space for people who don't share the same perspectives. I think it's really important as well to learn, especially in these political spaces and in spaces where there's a lot of ego, UN is one of them, I suppose, but that it's okay to step back and let someone else speak, and that's important as well. So lastly, I think my life trajectory was quite unusual, and there's one thing that I learned from being given a lot of influence at a younger age, which was it's really important never to give your power away once you're given a seat at the table. And I think a lot of, we go through our lives seeking that prestigious title, that great byline, that check on our Twitter profiles. But what we don't realize is that if we don't use that influence to change the status quo, then that influence becomes useless. And if we have influence but we don't use it to voice our conscience, then that influence becomes useless. So can we change Parliament Hill? Can we change the UN? And can we work to change these spaces that sometimes can make decisions that do violence to women? I very much think we can, and I think it starts here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, despite sitting at the far right, I'm apparently going to talk a bit more on the left of politics. And I was a little bit nervous to be asked to this panel because I've never been elected to political office nor appointed as a political appointee. But it's fair to say that although I currently find myself politically homeless, which I'm happy to discuss with any Brit, until very recently, and since my 20s, I was in the Labour Party. But I'm not going to speak from within the Labour Party, but rather from how I've experienced gender equality issues from within what's often seen as the progressive side of politics, where everything's going to be fine and rosy, right? By the way, I'm not at all sure what that story that Julia tells you about me, except for that I'm as fond of bad wine as I am of mansplaining. And, my approach in all of this is that the personal is political. It's an old feminist slogan, and I think what's so beautiful in hearing your two stories is to remind ourselves of that, and that we take those personal experiences into whichever political sphere we operate within. So reflecting back on the 30 plus years I've been working in social justice issues, where my feminism has really motivated everything I do, I was thinking a little bit about some of the tussles and challenges we had very early on where we wouldn't think to have them. So, as Julia mentioned, my first book was called Vamps, Virgins and Victims, How Can Women Fight AIDS? And why did I call it that? Well, in the early 90s, and I've been working in HIV since the mid-80s, the ways in which women were treated were extraordinary. Now, there weren't very many women with HIV, which is extraordinary now when we are, used to the fact that the majority epidemic in many countries is now women and girls. But at that time, women were categorised either as tremendous sexually voracious vamps, or they were poor little virgins and they should be kept that way, or they were the sort of powerless victims of some terrible crime that had happened to them. But our agency as real women, real girls, was often really hidden in that. And a couple of times when we first sort of encountered that in the political space was early on there was some legislation to try to prevent curb crawling in the UK, so men stopping women who were working in the sex industry, and it was very gendered at that time. And many people in the left really got behind that, and they wanted to protect these poor women from these men. But actually the sex worker collective said, hang on a minute, this is going to make our life so much more dangerous. It's going to make our life so much more dangerous because we won't be able to make rational decisions about whether or not we choose a client. And at that time within the left, this was such a tough conversation because what we needed to do was protect women and protect them from their false consciousness of thinking that they could involve themselves in such a profession. And in the end, the HIV organisations were able to get behind preventing the bill from coming into place and making sure that sex working women were well protected and able to actually pursue their work the way they wanted to. around a similar time, again in the early days of the AIDS movement in the UK, I got to know a woman called Kai, who just set up a shop called Shush, and it was a sex shop for women. And she got herself in terrible trouble with the local council, which was a very, very left-wing council in London, because having set up this shop, she put her dildos standing up. And this was against one of the obscene acts that she had her products on display in this way, which they felt was lewd and inappropriate. She had to lie them down. And so we at the Terence Higgins Trust got behind this and went, hang on a minute, this woman was doing the most extraordinary safer sex education, continues to do so, and in fact now works a lot with women who've been cut and also women who've been raped to help them to rediscover their sexual pleasure after experiencing that kind of violence, as well as working with women who just, quite frankly want to enjoy sex. But what we had to use again in this argument in a very left-wing council was, you're going to save lives if you do this. Now that's back in the 80s, but then I fast forward to the last time I was here in New York. And I was here in New York with She Decides at the time, and we had a phenomenal panel, extraordinary. We had ministers from, I think, 3 continents sitting on that panel alongside young leaders and NGO leaders, and they were there to talk about She Decides, a movement that's about decisions about the body. They spoke powerfully and brilliantly about abortion. And then suddenly a couple of them decided to talk about the evils of prostitution, the evils of pornography. In fact, they also talked about, I had to write it down because I still find it so extraordinary, the evils of assisted reproduction. And that all of these things were anti-feminist and anti-women. And what it really made me reflect on were those sex wars that happened in the 80s between feminists who were anti-porn and feminists who were anti-censorship. And so I thought, goodness me, how we have moved and not moved at all, because amongst this sisterhood from the left, we found this protectionism and this decision-making for women about how we might decide about our bodies coming back to the fore. One of the things I did want to say, which is, here I am on the left, as you look at me at least, is that having been sort of very much involved in that progressive or that left side, I also want to really acknowledge, I think, the points that you've both been making about how all sides of politics come together so well. And I remember that in the early days of HIV, actually some of the most progressive policies in the UK were under our first female Prime Minister, who was not of the left. Now, when Malaya and I worked in British government, we worked for a Labour government, and at that time we were able to really advance a lot of work on HIV, on access to medicines and so forth. I was really pleased to hear that just an hour ago, the current Prime Minister of my country, who's not particularly of the left, announced £600 million for UNFPA and said that sexual and reproductive health and rights are central to universal health coverage. Now that is not a universally accepted position in the current declaration, I'm told. I'm looking to hear what's actually happened. But that really reminds me that getting stuck into thinking that one political party can support gender equality and not another is a false consciousness. And I think the final thing I'd like to say is just seeing so many fabulous She Decides people in the room, but also one of the things I'm really proudest of what we built in those first 2 years of She Decides is a really cross-partisan and cross-country movement where I'm a friend of She Decides, we've got a remarkable range of politicians from all countries and from all shades of the political spectrum who will stand up and say that, I think as I heard you say, whatever your personal views, you can have whatever they like. At the end of the day, it's for that individual woman, that individual girl, to have the power, the knowledge, the education, the services, and the policies, guidelines, and legal construct wherein she makes her decision about her body and not anybody else, without question.
Beautiful. And we wanted to offer the audience a few minutes to ask some questions. Excellent, we have a question back there. I had forgot to say, which I was going to say at the beginning, that I needed lots of audience, hollering. because I had promised the panelists. I know, I should have said at the beginning, I'm sorry. Because I promised the panelists that this would be more fun than any other UNGA presentation all week. And then we were like, well, how are we going to present the information at panel? And I was like, oh man, that's how we always do things. However, there's a limited way of delivering great information to crowds of people. And so we did a panel, but I hope in these questions, I hope you'll bring some questions forward. Ask them, be bold. Who's going to put their hand up first? From the back there in the purple shirt. Fuchsia, the fuchsia shirt. Should I run around with the mic? I think you have to.
Good evening, my name is Mark. Thanks for joining us. We have an interesting conversation on the eve of the General Assembly as we all gather here in the UN. 90% of the marriages in India, as I recently read, are arranged. We're talking about everyone from child brides to whatever age. And the equality, women are obviously on the forefront of all these issues. What do you think about that? 90% of the marriages in India are arranged. You enlighten yourself. I mean, how do you guys position yourselves? Where are you going with this? I mean, your organization are doing with this?
We all support child marriage.
I'll maybe take a couple questions. Someone over here has to ask a question. Come on. Come on, everybody. Do we have any Facebook Live questions, Laurin?
Yeah. Maybe just okay.
So we have a question from Facebook Live. The question is, what are simple actions that we can all take in our everyday lives that will push the boundaries to advance gender equality?
I'll take one more and then I'll let you respond.
Hi, my name is David from Ecuador. Last week in Ecuador there was the debate of legalizing abortion in cases of rape, which is currently penalized. Unfortunately, the result was to keep the legislation against abortion. Abortion is still illegal in cases of rape. So I was wondering, from your perspective as parliamentarians or working in the governments, how to deal with these issues, and also as an advocate, also how can we improve this? Because I always see that we are progressive in progressive spaces already, but how to deal with the opposition? Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll take those and then I'll take a few more.
I'll quickly respond to the child marriage question, which is such an important one. I didn't mean to be flip in my response. Absolutely devastating. When you take a child and take away her entire future and enslave her, it is so counter to anything productive for development, for a society, for a community. Critical issue. I think it's something that we all need to be aware of and be huge champions to fight against. So thank you for raising it. I'm going to take the Facebook Live question, which is, what is something that each of us can do in our everyday lives to be champions for gender equality? So for me, I work in finance, and something very simple that every person can do is consider gender material in their decisions, particularly their decisions when it comes to finance and where you're investing. Money is an incredible tool to shift human behavior. Super powerful. And if we can use money to make gender equitable change, we will actually see a lot more movement, I think, than we've currently seen. So one example of that is when you're looking at investments, look for things that are gender certified or have EDGE certification or a female CEO. Ask your financial advisor, do you have any products that support gender equality? Those are some of the things that I've learned to do, and it makes me feel really good about where my money's going.
So I'll just briefly answer, also tag along on that Facebook Live question, and I think something that's really important is to integrate gender into your decision making. One example from Parliament Hill was that every private member's bill that any member of our caucus would table went through a gender analysis. So it was expected that that MP who was tabling the bill could speak knowledgeably about how that bill would positively or negatively impact women and men. So I think that's something that we can do in many, across organizations. I think it's really important to ask for gender disaggregated data and to actually make evidence-based decisions based on different groups that may be more vulnerable or that may not benefit as directly from any given project or programming decision. But I think for those of us who don't necessarily work in those spheres, I think one thing that's really important is to develop that empathy through reading more, and that's something that I've developed in my own life. But I think that's a really powerful tool for stepping into someone else's shoes and understanding what different viewpoints might be.
Thank you. 3 great questions, and thanks very much for them. I mean, I think the point on India and the point on early and forced marriage is hugely important, and we don't have a world where she decides if she's too young to decide or not involved in the decision about her life partner. Now, I do respect that there are families and cultures where families get involved in decisions about long-term partners, but that's entirely different from when someone is forced into marriage under the age of 18. And I think one of the things that I would say, which sort of links to the second question, is monitor, hold people to account. In fact, in India, a piece of legislation was brought in last year, shepherded by one of the She Decides champions, Indira Jaising, who's an extraordinary advocate. And what that did was make it illegal for sex to happen within a child marriage, where one of the parties were under 18. But I'm not aware of many prosecutions. And that's a really pragmatic thing that Indira did, was to say, hang on a minute, if you're going to end up married, then just understand that this girl is not consenting to this situation. But I think we need to use the tools that are there, use the law, use the policies, use the guidelines. Your point on Ecuador and the inadequate legislation around abortion, and that we know that there's even worse legislation in some countries in your region, I think it's an incredibly challenging one, but I think part of what I love about the She Decides model is find your comrades, find ways of banding together, and start to use the kind of smart tactics you get from good ex-MPs about how to advocate and how to help people to see the inequity, and that means gender disaggregated data, it means good evidence. I think it also means changing language. And I think, again, that's a really powerful way of changing the conversation. You did it in the way you spoke so beautifully about your personal circumstances and just helping people to turn it into real life rather than a toxic debate between pro-life, pro-choice. That's where we end up in these appalling situations where people don't see the humanity behind their bad decisions.
Excellent. We had a couple more questions.
It's not exactly great, but I'll stand up. It's not so much a question, but I'm a big fan over the last year of Brené Brown, and that came out of my personal experience, and I think you sent me the link to her first video. We go a bit too far back. But I think everyone on this panel has made themselves vulnerable, and I just think that that's something that's really, really underestimated in terms of feminist leadership, the ability to take risks, to be vulnerable, and to dare to lead. And that's all these concepts, I think. And Kathryn, you shared a really deeply personal story, and that's sometimes not easy to do, but we're able to learn and to feel and have lessons from that. Robin, when I met Robin, I'm going to move, because he said it was supposed to be exciting.
Please,
but me moving is not exciting.
We can start dancing.
Okay? But when I met Robin, we were working for the Department for International Development, and I was a Canadian, so I was a bit out of a fish out of water. The first thing I asked, I don't know, the Canadians, I asked my new boss what HMG meant on day one, which is Her Majesty's Government, and he said, "You signed the contract, you work for us." You know, so. But I had never met anyone like Robin, certainly not anyone who worked in such a conservative, institutional, patriarchal structure. So I learned an awful lot from her. She's a little older than me. So I was, able to, and I learned an awful lot about what it really meant beyond the theoretical in real sense of the word, to apply those feminist principles. No matter what institution or where you work, you can do it if you dare to lead. And Laurin, your experience of sexual harassment that you related to us here, thank you very, very much for sharing that, because I think people really underestimate the tremendous personal impact and to a large extent the social ostracization that happens once you share. You really discover who your friends are and who they aren't. I have found in that case, so thank you very much for sharing that. And for the men in the fuchsia shirt, the figure is 12 million child marriages per year, and that's about one girl every 2 seconds. And I think that should really help us put it in perspective. So I didn't have a question, but
I think there was one more question, and then there's one from Facebook Live. Tikala, can I put, oh, 2, I've got 2, 3. Okay, let's take some questions. I'm gonna run to Tikala, please.
I think it's just to say thank you to the panelists, because it's always so empowering to have women share their stories. And I think back in the days, we never used to have a platform where women could openly share their stories. So I think to just thank all the panelists for that. And secondly, to say that we're in a reality right now where we're having this conversation, but reality is head of states right now are saying no to reproductive health, right? And it makes you think of all the effort and all the movements and all the work that people have been doing the past few years to just get reproductive health on the agenda. And just wanting to hear from all of you, you know, where do we go from here? Because it's like the wheel has to start all over again, because we got the agenda on reproductive health and issues around women on the papers years ago, but now it's like we're starting this all over again. Why are we still talking about why reproductive health matters, you know? And I want to hear from you. And I've had an opportunity to work with Robin, and as Malaya has said, she's a badass. And I know there's been a lot of work of being very persistent and working with political leaders to commit to what is right. And you've done amazing work around that. And I'm trying to figure out, but why are we still here again when we have to keep pushing again and keep lobbying again? Where are we going wrong?
Yeah, this is more to Kathryn. Well, thanks to you all. I've really enjoyed this. This has been enlightening. Regarding the work of OPIC, I was wondering, and this goes a little bit to your comments, when you make an investment in women's issues, in order to sort of buffer the investment from the political tides that are common with around USAID investments. I've worked at the World Bank, and I understand a little bit how that works. Are there certain things that you could do to make sure that the program is sustainable and long-lasting, metrics, criteria, and things of that sort that you sort of plant in the programs to make these interventions long-lasting and enduring?
And I think we have one question back here, and then we'll take one more from Facebook Live and come back.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for your fascinating insights. I'm Levi from South Africa. Quick question. So one of the things that we really do admire in the Global South from the Global North is the fact that sexual reproductive health rights and reproductive rights in general tends to be a bipartisan issue. But in the Global South, it's really different. And even in South Africa, we're very progressive. We have some of the most progressive legislation and policies in the world when it comes to reproductive rights and reproductive justice. But sexual reproductive health rights is not a bipartisan issue. So in your experiences and collective experiences at that, what are some of the effective strategies that you would use to ensure that you can build progressive consensus, to ensure that there's some bipartisan prioritization for sexual reproductive health rights and reproductive justice issues amongst, beyond just bipartisan party lines? And then the second question I had was around state virginity and gender equality. The OECD last year released a report on states of fragility, and the report indicated that 35 out of 55 African states were considered to be fragile across matrices of economic, social, political, and environmental fragility. what effect do you think that state fragility would have on advancing gender equality in the next 130 months that we have between now and 2030 in terms of realizing SDG 5?
Thank you. We'll take one from Facebook Live and then close off the comment.
Yeah, so our question is, how do we start difficult or uncomfortable conversations with people who may not see the value in advancing gender equality or who may feel as though gender equality has already been achieved?
Right, so I'll let the panelists, do you have the mic still? No?
Oh, yes. Stop.
Maybe, yeah. I want to make a couple comments. Thank you. I'm sorry, what's your name from South Africa? Levi, what a fantastic question. I hope one day you dedicate your efforts to teaching. You're incredibly articulate and had a great point. I want to not answer it and flip it back on you and say, to what extent has gender inequality caused states to be fragile? Because so often we're looking at things like, oh, Afghanistan, you know, the literacy rates for women are so low, and the child marriage rates are so high, and the treatment of women is so bad because of the instability in this state. Maybe that state is not stable because it's not treating its women well. And so I think sometimes reversing that question is just an interesting thing to do, but I certainly don't believe that any fragile or failing state is going to make large strides on gender equality. Although I've heard people say Rwanda made large strides on gender equality because it wiped out so many of its men. So I don't think that's the approach that we want to take. On sustainable investments in OPIC and the work that we do, I would love to do an entire hour panel on this. We only make sustainable investments. We're a commercial financial institution that returns $300 million to the US Treasury every year. And so every investment that we make must make a return on our principal and also have an impact and live up to best practices and transparency. So we have an entire office that tracks the impact and measures the results of our investments. And in terms of having difficult conversations about people that may think we've already achieved gender equality, I love this question because I think I was one of those people. You know, I was raised in a family where you can do anything and you just work hard and it's a meritocracy. And I lived that and I experienced it, and I had a great career and was an equal partner with my all-male venture capital team until I was the only female, and that didn't quite work. You know, you have to really experience something, and sometimes just being young is really good for being progressive and open-minded, but not really good in that you haven't quite experienced some of life's you know, disappointments. And it often takes that to really appreciate where you do sit in the hierarchy. And learning about the treatment of women globally has also been a fascinating journey for me in terms of developing my feminism to a rampant rate. So the one suggestion that I'll throw out there is taking a look at The Moment of Lift, which is Melinda Gates' book, which I think is a fascinating must-read for folks that believe that we live in a gender-equal world.
Okay. Brilliant question, Levi. I'm so glad Kathryn threw it back on you. Perfect. I agree. It's a really tough question and a really important one. And I'm going to duck it because I think she said everything that she should. I mean, the questions about how to begin the difficult conversations, for me, go back to that conversation about language and finding new ways to get in there, because I think if we get stuck in the same table tennis game of they feel that and I feel this and I'm right, no, they're wrong, we'll never move forward. And so I think it is that opportunity to listen, but also to try to bring the humanity and the evidence into the conversation is the only way I know how. And then sort of moving out to the bigger question of politics, I suppose, as we've all been saying, there are great people in all parties. So this idea of the bipartisan, you know, back at the beginning of the AIDS crisis in the UK, we set up an all-party parliamentary group on AIDS. I think it was the first in the world. And it remains really, really exciting to me because it really does bring in all political parties. And I think, You see that in terms of the conversation we've been having, but not making assumptions, I think, is one of the most important bits about achieving political change. And, you know, to Carla, to your point about how we're going to get there, and it is very easy to feel defeated right now. It is really, you know, hard at times to see how we're ever going to move forward. And yet, in parallel with seeing some of the policies that are disturbing and upsetting to us all, we do know that there is a groundswell. And we do know that that's happening. And I just keep looking at Ireland. I was told not to mention any particular country, but there you go, I've just messed that one up. But the reason I mention Ireland is because I think it's really interesting how they've had these two referenda, and particularly the most recent one on repeal the 8th. Where did that come from? You know, and it came from a lot of things that were happening politically, socially, in terms of religion in that country. But it also came from the fact that I believe politicians realised that's what their electorate wanted. And at the end of the day, politicians want to get elected. And so they need to be persuaded that their people are behind them. And so that's where I think sort of, you know, working hard on growing movements, working hard on having those difficult conversations is absolutely critical to getting the change that we need.
I guess I'll just pick up on that point on governance, which I think is really interesting. And you know, I think there's debate around the term fragile state and how it's used and what it's used for, but it's really important to see the interrelatedness of governance and the environment and climate, which the world's attention is focused on today and throughout the week, and women's rights. So I had sort of a really interesting meeting this morning with a coalition of different civil society movements, including Indigenous folks, conservation groups, environmentalists, and human rights activists. And you know, the conversation is changing. We're making links between ecocide and femicide. We're talking about how there is a link between a disregard for the environment and misogyny. So things like targeting Greta Thunberg, you know, there is in countries and governments where there is a rampant destruction of the environment, women's rights do not tend to be very well protected as well. And so I think one of the most exciting things for me about UNGA is actually not necessarily what's happening in UNHQ, but what's happening around it. Last week there was the People Summit, which was a huge effort by Amnesty, Greenpeace, and the UN Office of Human Rights to really link the movements, the environmental movement and the human rights movement. Typically sort of coalitions or movements that have worked in silos and haven't really spoken to each other. So I think the sooner that we realize that you know, women's rights can be solutions in addressing the climate crisis and addressing environmental conservation, the sooner that we'll be able to make progress on it together.
Ooh, it's working. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our Facebook Live audience who has been with us. I'm getting a lot of nods, a lot of folks. And mostly just thank you to the panelists. Your remarks were beautiful, they were personal, they were compelling, they were interesting, and they were also forward-looking. And I think if we're going to do this Gender Equality Week thing, that's what we've got to do. So go out and do all the UN things, but stay and chat with us for an exciting conversation as well. Thank you all for being here.